Today we're going to dig a little deeper into climate and how it affects what's happening on the Earth. In this first part, we'll look at our climate regions and the impacts on the hydrologic cycle, as well as what that means for plants and soil. Just a quick refresher from our previous lesson. Weather is the short-term variation in temperature, precipitation, etc. Climate is the long-term variation of these things, averages taken over long periods like multiple decades. We looked earlier at a climate map which organizes the Earth into climatic regions. These regions experience similar climate conditions and are not static. Ecosystems are a product of the living creatures and physical environment of an area, which is influenced by climate. Broad-scale ecosystems are biomes, which we'll get to a bit later. This little map in the corner reflects the Greek division of the world into torrid or hot zones, temperate zones, and frigid zones. So even before we had the massive amount of global climate data we have now, it was understood that there were distinct, if oversimplified, climate regions. Here's our very general climate map from before, with 6 basic zones. Let's look at these in more detail. Tropical climates are warm all year and are characterized by heavy rainfall, either all year or with a distinct rainy season. Tropical rainforests are rainy all year, while monsoon regions are seasonally rainy but with very high levels of rainfall. Savanna climates have a distinct rainy season, but with less rainfall than monsoon climates. Arid and semi-arid climates are defined by their precipitation amounts, which are very small. We often think of deserts as hot, such as the Sahara or our own Mojave, but this climate type also includes cold deserts, such as the Great Basin in the US, or the Gobi in Asia, or even Antarctica. Mesothermal climates are characterized by moderate amounts of rainfall, warm summers, and cool, but not cold, winters. 2 special subtypes of these are the marine west coast climate that covers much of the Pacific Northwest, with less warm summers, and the Mediterranean climate with dry summers found around the Mediterranean and in parts of California. Microthermal climates are our continental climates, with warm summers and cold winters. The subarctic sections don't make it to warm in the summer and may have really cold winters. Remember that this type only exists in the northern hemisphere because it requires large land masses to resist the moderating effect of oceans. The coldest of all the zones is the polar climate, which consists of tundra and ice cap. Highland climates are the extremely variable climates found in mountainous areas, but their high elevations can also mean persistently cold temperatures. So which zone is Arcata in? If you said marine west coast, you're correct. California is covered by several zones because of its large size. Which zone do you live in? We spend a lot of time talking about climate because it's important not just in terms of how comfortable it might be to live somewhere, but in how it impacts our environment in other ways. The hydrologic cycle refers to the process of water moving through the atmosphere, biosphere, and lithosphere. We know from our weather lessons that water stores heat, so it impacts temperature. We also know that it's involved in chemical and mechanical weathering of the lithosphere. It's also a principal component of all living things which depend on it for survival. When moisture in the air reaches a sufficient level, it falls to the earth as precipitation, which could be in the form of rain, snow, hail, etc. When it reaches the earth, it might soak into the ground and become part of the groundwater, where it's drawn out by people for drinking water, or it's drawn out by plants through their roots, then transported back into the atmosphere. It might not soak in, but run off and form streams and other water bodies. From there, it can evaporate directly back to the atmosphere, and then the whole process starts over again. Anything that alters or interferes with one part of this cycle impacts the whole thing. Water comes down to the earth in the form of precipitation. Some of it may soak into the ground, and some may run off into water bodies. Some might even evaporate if conditions are right. Evaporation is the process of returning directly to the atmosphere, for example, from a body of water, or the drying of soil or rock. Water absorbed by plants is returned to the atmosphere by transpiration. You might think of this as a little bit like how humans perspire. Evapotranspiration is the combined process of water returning directly to the atmosphere and water returning to the atmosphere through plants. When water hits the soil, it soaks in to some extent, which we call infiltration. Once it soaks in, it may be drawn up directly by plant roots, or it may percolate, which is the process of moving down through the soil to the groundwater. Although we tend to think of lakes and rivers as our main sources of fresh water, groundwater is actually the largest source. Almost half the population of the U.S. gets its drinking water from groundwater, but it's most commonly used for irrigation. Groundwater is highly susceptible to contamination as it's not refilled directly from precipitation, but after that water has percolated through the soil. Anything that's in the soil is going to end up in the groundwater, so pollutants from landfills, gas stations, and other chemical storage facilities, public and private wastewater facilities, and pesticides, fertilizer, and animal waste from agriculture can all end up in the groundwater. Soil and rock can act as a filter if there's enough of it between the surface and the groundwater. But overdrawing from wells can increase the rate of contamination. It's a bit like drinking from a straw, and as groundwater is withdrawn, it percolates downward faster, which means the soil doesn't have time to do its job. Water demand by plants is seasonal, which you probably already know if you've ever had a garden or even a flower pot outside. Warmer temperatures mean that plants, like people, need more water. There's more transpiration happening, especially with deciduous trees, which drop their leaves in the winter and don't transpire at all, although they still need some water to survive. By contrast, a mature oak tree can draw up to 50 gallons of water a day through its roots in the summer. The depth of the root system determines how much water is available to the plant. Shallow root systems feel drought more quickly, while deep roots can draw from a larger soil area and may also be able to reach groundwater sources. In this example from the Midwest, the deep-rooted natives are better suited to the dense clay soils of the region. Not only can they reach deep sources of water, but they can break up the dense clay, allowing more water to penetrate to the groundwater. Shallow non-natives, often planted for landscaping, must be regularly irrigated to survive, and the soil is not broken up by the more delicate roots, meaning more rainwater runs off instead of soaking in. To calculate how much water is left over, or how much more is needed, we use a water budget. Potential evapotranspiration is how much water could be returned to the atmosphere through evaporation and transpiration if the plants had as much water as they wanted. Actual evapotranspiration is how much is actually returned. In this example here, this watershed received 72 inches of precipitation. Evapotranspiration accounts for 46 inches of it. Another 23 inches runs right off directly to surface water sources. Groundwater receives and discharges 2 inches to wetlands and wells, and another inch goes into storage for use during dry periods. In this graph, potential evapotranspiration is indicated by the red line. If precipitation is insufficient to meet this, as we see during the summer months, irrigation and withdrawal from storage are necessary to sustain the plant. During the first few months of the year, there is a surplus, which recharges the storage in the soil. Once demand exceeds rainfall, around May, plants draw out the moisture from the soil, or are irrigated. If there is still not enough moisture, actual evapotranspiration will be less than potential evapotranspiration, which can result in wilting or dormancy in plants. As summer wanes and plant water demand decreases, the soil moisture is recharged by the rainfall. In an environment with insufficient regular precipitation to meet demand, soil moisture storage is gradually depleted. If no irrigation is applied, soil moisture will eventually be depleted and the plants will die. Potential evapotranspiration is greater than actual transpiration. If irrigation is applied, soil moisture is replenished and plants survive. Potential evapotranspiration and actual evapotranspiration are the same. In today's precision agriculture, satellite imagery and other technology is often used to monitor soil moisture levels for efficient use of resources. But in many areas, irrigation is still applied irregularly, resulting in over or under watering. Vegetation can tell us a lot about the climate of a region. Trees need and process a lot of water, so they're more plentiful where it's rainy. They also reduce the reflection of insolation, so they help regulate temperature. Vegetation holds soil in place with its roots, so a good ground cover can help stop erosion. Think about if you've ever passed a construction site when it's raining, all that muddy water just running into the street, carrying away soil and nutrients. The removal of trees and vegetation impacts the process of returning rainwater to the atmosphere, so we lose the ability to hold the soil in place, and we lose a mechanism to process carbon. If we do this too much, the general quality of the soil degrades, and with it the ability to sustain vegetation, and already dry areas become deserts with no vegetation to sustain life and keep the soil in place. Soil is formed as rocks break down and mix with organic matter. Soil health is tied to vegetation health and water availability. Soil can store water for later use, but compacted soils have little to no room between the particles for water storage, and bare soil can evaporate quickly and bake into a hard surface that repels water, which is just one reason why cover crops are an important part of sustainable agriculture. Deforestation and construction processes can remove vegetation, which helps hold moisture in place, and natural events such as flooding or landslides can also compact or expose soil. Humid soils pass a lot of moisture and are subject to nutrient leaching. Soil texture refers to the size and organization of particles in the soil. There are three basic categories: clay, silt, and sand. Clay is the finest particles, which expand and contract regularly, which means that soils often crack when they dry out in the summer. They also, when they get wet, expand, and so the soil can heave up in wet seasons. Sand contains the largest particles and drains very quickly. Silt is larger than clay, but smaller than sand. The ideal mix is a balanced loam somewhere in the middle. Soil is constantly forming and breaking down. Agriculture can accelerate this process by removing nutrients, and erosion can remove rich soils. For agriculture, soils are often augmented with some sort of fertilizer. Synthetic fertilizer adds nutrients but does not alter soil texture and may not add all necessary nutrients being consumed by the crops, which can lead to soil fatigue or the need to add increasing amounts of fertilizer each season. Organic additives, such as tilling in a cover crop, can improve both nutrients and texture. They may take longer to deploy, but typically have a longer lasting benefit. This brings us to the carbon-oxygen cycle. I don't know about you, but I'm pretty fond of breathing. The carbon dioxide that I and other animals exhale is absorbed by plants, and the plants are then eaten by animals. Carbon dioxide is also released when wood and fossil fuels are burned, which contributes to the greenhouse gases we talked about earlier. Carbon dioxide levels vary with the seasons because remember that deciduous trees drop their leaves and many plants die back in the winter, so there are fewer plants to consume and store the CO2. Plants take in carbon dioxide from the air and water from the soil and energy from the sun and create carbohydrates, which they store, and oxygen, which they release. People and animals, on the other hand, do basically the opposite. We take in carbs from plants and other stuff too, and breathe in oxygen. We breathe out carbon dioxide, store water, and give off energy in the form of heat. Soils are related to climate types. The amount of moisture and type of vegetation impact soil formation and development. Humid regions experience leaching, so few nutrients remain. They require frequent fertilization. Arid soils are high in minerals but low in organic matter, so they can be very useful if irrigated. Mid-latitude humid soil quality depends on the type of forest cover. Evergreens mean poorer soil. Mid-latitude subtropical soils are nicely balanced between moist and arid and are highly fertile. Mountainous regions suffer from heavy erosion. In the next video, we'll classify climate, vegetation, and soil information into biomes.